The next stage in the iconographic process is the highlights, the highlighting. So when we go about describing or expressing a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface, how we approach that in our culture is we like to use shading. We like to start with a white ground and add dark on top of it. That's logical to people in our culture. We have access to white paper, and that's how we learn to draw. And that just seems the most straightforward way to go about representing a three-dimensional form. But it's important to note that was not always the case, and that is not the case in all cultures. In many cultures, that would seem very counterintuitive. A more intuitive or natural way, at least from the perspective of the ancient world where the iconographic techniques come from, is that the painting process mimics nature. Art imitates nature, as Aristotle famously put it. And we even apply that to the process of image creation. So in nature, the form already exists out there, and what reveals the form, what allows the form to enter into visibility, is the medium of light. The light coming in and encountering and enveloping the object. So ancient painters, when they wanted to paint a scene or a figure or an object, what they would do is start with that darkness and use the paint as if it were light revealing the form. They would build up in a series of highlights. And that is typically how we work in icon painting. You can work other ways. There are different ways that do use heavy shading, but this is kind of the classical expression of the technique. And it's very well suited for a medium like egg tempera. Egg tempera has certain characteristics, one of them being opalescence, how light passes through and what colors are augmented by whether the light's passing through it or bouncing off of it, affects how we use the medium. But also egg tempera is a semi-opaque medium. It's unlike oil, to where with oil paints it's so saturated that light easily enters and bounces in through the paint film. Egg tempera is a little different. You can reflect more light off of it, which means it can hold up more to this kind of stacking or layering process. So the highlight process cooperates really with that medium, and it does come from the philosophy of the ancient world that understood rendering three-dimensional objects completely differently than we do perhaps in our culture. So in that sense, the highlighting process has both a technical meaning and a symbolic meaning. Iconographers are those who reveal with divine light. They're ones who work in light. There's a wonderful passage in Scripture, I believe it's in the Book of Wisdom or maybe Proverbs. I'll put it in the lecture notes, but it goes something like it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the glory of kings to make it known. So we start off this whole process with concealing the form. It's etched in, but then we conceal it and obscure it. We make it difficult to find. And then we go about this process of responding to the form that's already there. I think of that famous saying of Michelangelo, where he would say the statue is already in the marble. I see it already there. The form is there, and what I do is reveal it. Well, icon painters, we do virtually the same thing, but with paint, revealing the form. On a practical level, there are at least 3 highlights. There can be more than 3, there can be subtle blending in between, but we like to keep it at 3 highlights. And each of those highlights have sort of their own character, and also some ascribe a symbolic meaning to each stage of the highlight process. But each highlight reduces in size. So it does have a pyramidal structure. If you take the painting surface and you cut it and look at it under a microscope, it will make a pyramid as as these highlights get smaller and smaller. So they decrease in size, but they increase in brightness and saturation. So how bright the color is and how saturated, how intense the color is. So there's a decrease in size, increase in brightness, pyramidal structure to those highlights. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you the 3 highlights that are on the garments. Now, I made these images digitally, so we don't have to watch me paint. Maybe that would be a fun video to make at some point. But I just want to show you how we stack up the layers. So this is the first highlight, and you can see that it's rather diffuse. It's not as faceted. The edges are not all that sharp. It covers about 3/4 of the area of the form, and it does involve some blending, some nice brushwork. But in this first highlight, we're getting basically the main shape of the object worked in. And then here is the second light. So obviously, the first highlight and the second highlight are really dramatically different. We still do see a little bit of blending at the edges, but now that faceting really starts to show through. And also the forms are not as large. Now we're faceting different aspects of the larger basic form. And again, that faceting all comes out of, good brushwork. And here is an example, if we add it on top, of the third highlight. And the third highlight is the most richly faceted of all the highlights. We do want to see those shapes come through. There's not a lot of blending that goes on in the third highlight. And if we were to ascribe an analogy to these 3 highlights, the first highlight is often seen as the light of nature, of human reason in and of itself. And we can start to discern, the logoi, the plans of God, the forms, the intentions of God in creation. But it's not brought to full completion. It's there. They're inside the lines. We've discerned the lines, but it's not complete. The second highlight is the light of revelation. So when God reveals himself, or more particularly when he revealed the moral law to Moses, he was cooperating with natural law. He was cooperating with the light of natural reason, but adding a further explanation, a further explication of reality. And that's what that second highlight symbolizes. It symbolizes the Old Covenant. It symbolizes the light of revelation, where now the light of God is starting to dawn and bring things to more light and more clarity. And finally, we come to that third highlight. Many see this third highlight as a theandric light, the light of Christ, the light of God revealing himself in and as a human being, or in the human nature. So, as you can see, it's the most intensely faceted, but it's not completely separated from the other 2 lights. It's still cooperating with them. It's still fully revealing the form. It's not alien to those subsequent highlights. So that's why we say it's theandric. It's the light of the God-man. The next highlight that we have on top of this that is not really part of the 3 are lights we call enlivening lights. And this is very typical in icons. If you ever go up to an icon and you look closely, especially in the face, you will see these very pure, very thin lights of either in the face of pure white or in the garments of the extreme brightness. It could be the same color, but also white is used. That can get a little garish if you use white on colored garments, but these are the light of grace. These are lights that are not integrated at all into those 3 highlights, but fully reveal them nonetheless. So this is the divine light of God that is shining through that form. We call it enlivening lines, because this is what gives the icon its dynamism. When I'm working with students, they often get quite amazed because we go through these 3 highlights and the image still looks dull. It doesn't really come alive, especially in the face, until we put those enlivening lights in, and it's almost the last thing we do. And when those lights go in, it's almost like the image, is activated. That's how you turn it on. And you can do so much with those lights. There's a whole art form in just using those enlivening lines. So that completes our highlight stack: 3 highlights and enlivening lines. Now, I said that in icon painting we don't work in shadows, and that's true to an extent, but there's also a process where if we need to put shadows in, we certainly can. There's nothing forbidden about that in icon painting. Some techniques of icon painting do work the other way around, that don't really rely heavily on highlights. So I'm not being an absolutist about this at all. But one of the things that we do once the highlight process is over is put back in those original contour lines. When I'm working with my students, we just go back to that initial underpainting color, the darkest value, and if anything got askew, we can actually hold the panel up and see the lines that we've etched in, that initial type, that prototype. And what we can do is clarify the type, fully reveal the type, and put it back into its perfect form. And that's where we do these contour lines, the very dynamic lines. There's a difference between a static line that you get from a pencil, a mechanical pencil in particular, or a pen, where the line sort of is the same thickness, but with a brush we can get dynamic lines. We can get lines that can express value, can express shadow, and we use that opportunity with these lines to fully display the contours of the form. And also the myriad of little details, the halo, the inscriptions, all of that needs to go in the icon before it's finished. This is also not an absolute rule, but typically in icon painting there is an order of operations, what we do first and when. What I like to do, what I actually learned in art school, so it's not particular of icons, but you do the background first, and then you move to the foreground. That creates nice, clean lines, but it also, you're working up towards that which is most important. So by the time you get there, the image is coming together, you're more confident, and you can execute more masterfully. You start with what's not important. I know my students oftentimes, the first thing they want to work on is the things that are most important to them, so they want to go straight to the eyes. Well, the eyes are the absolute last thing that we do. So we start from back to front, and as we're moving back to front, and even in our highlight process, we're clarifying over time. We start loose, we start messy, and we get tighter and tighter and more precise and more precise. But we also move to what's more important. So I start background, scenery, if there's mountains, as there often are in icons, and then I go to the garments, and then the last thing I like to paint is the faces themselves, because that's where I want to be most focused. That's what needs to be done with the most competence. So we move in now to the face painting. The face painting also has 3 highlights, but it has several stages extra. And one of the very interesting, very neat things about painting the face is we do have a very elaborate underpainting that goes in the face. Oftentimes in the literature, this is called the flesh tinting. So the flesh underpaint, very counterintuitively, is actually a dark olive gray. Sometimes you can use a brown. I've seen anywhere almost to a green blue. But we have this dark color that represents the shadows of the face. And in Mediterranean people, like myself, the shadows are more of an olive color. So that's what we start off with. But between this underpainting and the first highlight, we have this flesh tinting, which is an intense red-orange. The color that the ancients used, a color that I actually still use, is a very beautiful color called minium or vermilion. And both of these colors are sulfur oxides. They're very deadly if you were to ingest them, but they're the most intense, fiery orange red. Because what we're painting in this is flesh. Not just flesh, not just a chunk of meat, but living flesh. We believe these people are living in the glory of God. That's why the divine light is shining on them and through them. So we have to depict them as living. So we start with that lively, fiery color of red that we have as a foundation of our highlight process. And believe it or not, if you don't put that red in, when you put those highlights on top, because atempera is transparent, it's not as transparent obviously as oil paint, but it is transparent, that red actually shines through and enlivens, enrichens the yellows. If you don't have the red, the faces just look rather dull. They look static and almost what, as one of my students says, they look like they have a iron deficiency or something. So we have to put that red in, that fiery red. That's the flesh tinting process. After the flesh tinting, we move on to the highlights proper. Again, the first highlight, usually with face painting, is a form of yellow ochre. So the yellow ochre goes on, and as I've stated, the yellow ochre is slightly transparent, so that red form comes through it and actually creates this beautiful sensation of, as you're putting on the yellow ochre, the form of the face kind of materializes in front of you. Students are often quite moved by that sensation of when you're painting the face. And the next stage is the second highlight. Again, pyramidal structure, getting brighter, getting smaller. In the case of the face, this just means adding a little bit of white to the paint. And you can see here in the demonstration, the second light is a lot smaller than the first light. Now, after the second light, things can go awry. So at this point, if there does need to be shadows put back in, I put them back in. When I'm working with students, there invariably needs to be some corrections that happen in this stage. But also, if you're not careful, some of that red hue of the flesh tint, you start to lose it at this point. So this is the stage where we put in the rouging. Rouge is just a fancy word for red, and we put rouging into places that didn't have it before, like the lips, and there's strategic areas that the rouging goes. And I like to use that same fiery minium. It works wonderfully, and it gives the icons this very lively, very fiery feel. When you go up to a well-executed icon, the rouging, when you're looking for it, is very, very present, very dominant. It's one of the things that really makes that icon lively. So after the rouging, I like to do a lot of the detail work. There's a lot of edges that need to be cleaned up in the mouth. The eyelashes need to go in. For that, we just put a simple line. A lot of detail work goes in this in-between stage. But after the detail work, then we move on to that third highlight in the face. And as you can see, the third highlight is significantly smaller than the second. And again, it follows the same basic pattern as highlighting in the garments, but it's less faceted. So at least in the style I work in some styles like the Cretan school or even some schools of Russian icon painting, they have very dramatic face highlights. I tend to avoid that. But this third highlight, again, is just that same yellow color, but with more white. And then finally, in the face, we move on to those enlivening lines. In Greek, I forget how to say it at the moment, but it translates to lead lines, because again, they were using lead white pigment. So this was pure lead white. And you put those lead lines in, and that's what gives the icons its final liveliness, particularly around the eyes. It is at this point that the eyes begin to look at you, when the whites of the eyes go in, and there's a little a flicker of intention. The icon is not just staring into blank space, it's looking at you and into you and through you. One notable thing is we don't, as is often done in secular painting, we don't put a little white dot in the eye. That references reflected light. The icon doesn't draw attention to reflected light. The light is the light of the divine, not the light of temporal space. So we don't do that. So the whites or the enlivening lines in the eyes are just to describe the whites of the eyes. But it's really at this point that the icon comes fully alive. Throughout this face painting process, especially if you're working on an icon of the Lord, you really get the sense of Christ's redemptive work. Christ as the image of God. Christ restoring the image of God, which is man. So as we're moving out of that murky darkness, not only is God being revealed, but man is being revealed. What a human being actually is like is being revealed. Christ, of course, is the Alpha and the Omega. That original intention that is inscribed in the fabric of reality, inscribed into the panel, is now brought to its complete revelation or actualization in that face. So we have this entire process of redemption, entire process of salvation. It was the Russian Orthodox theologian Vladimir Milosky wrote a fantastic book called the Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, and in that there's this wonderful line where he says that salvation and revelation are the same process. Salvation just has to take care of sin, but it's all the same process. It's the Alpha and the Omega. It's human and divine communion that was ruptured by sin and had to be dealt with by our Lord, but the intention was always the same. It was always for God and man to have a communion, and that is achieved in Christ, particularly in his sleep and his resurrection on the 8th day, the day that fulfills creation. So that process really comes alive with this face painting, particularly when you're meditating on the face of Christ as it's slowly being revealed and then finally is disclosed in this the last stages of the process. So that is the last stage of the painting process, but that is not the last stage of the iconographic process. Really, the icon is finished, quite literally, when it's finished, when a finish or a varnish is put on the icon. The varnish that we like to use, oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as olifa, which I don't quite know what that means, but I know that's the Russian term, but it's just a very simple varnish. It's oil. If you want to put some dryers in it, that might be a good idea, and resin. And what the olifa or the varnish does is it seeps into the paint film. If you've ever, gone out to dinner and wiped your face or wiped your greasy hands on a napkin, and you hold that napkin up, you can see through it. Why? Well, because the oil saturates the film and allows light to get in. And that's what we're doing to the painted surface. We're slightly saturating it, making it ever so slightly more transparent, and that's causing light now to get into that paint film and actually bounce around inside that paint film and even bounce against that white panel and shine all the way back through. So it's very noticeable when you put that varnish on how intense the colors get, how things that looked a little harsh sort of mellow out, sort of blend out, but also how the icon is encountering and interacting with light. And with everything in icon painting, the finishing or the varnishing also has a symbolic meaning, because we know, of course, that the redemption that took place, the redemption of humanity that definitively took place in the Anastasis and the resurrection of the Lord was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning of the story. It was the beginning of the story of the new Adam. The story, of course, continues. There's an interim punctuated by the Ascension, and culminated by the day of Pentecost. And what happens at the day of Pentecost? Well, the Spirit of God comes down from heaven onto the Christian people and inspires them, and that is how the church is instituted, and that is how each of us come into life in Christ in our own personal Pentecost that happens at our baptism and chrismation. So that's what happens to the icon. Literally, we would say it's chrismated, not sacramentally, not obviously with the oil of chrism, but with oil, with charis, with grace. So we engrace the icon so it can become an agent of light, and that's how it's introduced to its life in Christian service. Its participation in the life of the church. We chrismate the icon. Now, in some traditions, there can also be a blessing of icons. That is quite just dependent on the tradition, even dependent on the priest. Some priests don't like to do it. It doesn't seem that it was done in the ancient world, but it is now a very common practice. And there are a handful of ways that I've seen it done. There are rubrics that provide prayers for the blessing of icons, where they're blessed with holy water. In the Russian form, it's a big old long prayer. In the Athonite form, it's not so long. The Greeks and the Russians, you'll often see that. But also in some traditions, we have a practice of placing the icon on the altar. So if you have an icon, or as an iconographer, if I complete an icon, I will give that to the priest or the deacon, and he will place it on the altar, and it stays on the altar all throughout divine liturgy. And in a lot of times, at least in the Melkite tradition, what happens if things are to be blessed, they're actually picked up after the consecration and they're touched to the chalice. Oftentimes in a parish context, everyone's always bringing icons, especially if someone's kid just got baptized. There's lots of icons to bless, and all of us acolytes will, have a conveyor belt line of things that need to be, placed to the holy chalice. But that's one tradition of how an icon is blessed. And once the icon is blessed, it's rendered for Christian use. One thing I will note: some people can be, let's say, scandalized if you bless it and you're going to sell it. Like for me, that's something I have to think about as an iconographer. I don't really bless things that I'm going to sell, but I bless icons that I just paint for my own self. So keep that in mind if you ever produce icons, but typically we do like the icons to be blessed. So that is more or less the whole process of icon painting. And the reason why I took the time to actually turn that into lectures is because I think it's important that people understand how much goes into an icon. It's not just that the subject matters are traditional, but how we make the icon, how we produce the forms, even our very brushstrokes are what we have received by the great tradition. So much contemplation, so much skill, so much patrimony and heritage goes into these objects. That's why we're so fortunate in the 20th century that these techniques that were almost at the verge of extinction were all recovered, right in the nick of time. So when we look at an icon, now we understand everything that has gone into it to make that possibility of prayer to happen that happens before these blessed images.